What happens when America's most polished journalist collides with the royal family's most controversial export? On paper, it looks harmless. Another primetime sit-down, another carefully managed interview designed to generate headlines. Without making anyone uncomfortable, a comfortable studio, polite smiles, controlled lighting. The illusion of civility wrapped in the soft authority of a CNN broadcast. But illusions have a way of collapsing when both sides walk in with very different intentions. Beneath the warm glow of the studio lights, this was never meant to be friendly. Anderson Cooper did not come to play along, and Meghan Markle did not come to be humbled. She arrived armed with defiance, dismissive smiles, and that unmistakable sharp edge of entitlement that has polarized audiences across continents. What was sold as a conversation quickly revealed itself as something else entirely, quiet but relentless confrontation, where every pause mattered and every word carried weight. From the opening exchange, the tension was subtle but undeniable. Cooper's voice was calm, measured, almost surgical. He asked questions the way he always does, precise, controlled, grounded in facts rather than emotion. Markle, on the other hand, leaned into performance. Her posture was flawless, her expressions carefully curated, her tone shifting between wounded sincerity and practiced indignation. This was not unfamiliar territory for her. She had told her story many times before. What she hadn't encountered often was resistance delivered without theatrics. The CNN studio gleamed under carefully calibrated lights designed to flatter rather than interrogate. Everything about the set was pristine, deliberate, controlled. Anderson Cooper sat with his cue cards aligned just so, his movements minimal, his stillness almost disarming. Years of war reporting and political interviews had taught him one thing above all else. Silence can be louder than accusation. Across from him sat Meghan Markle, perfectly poised, legs crossed, hands resting gently in her lap, projecting confidence with the ease of someone deeply familiar with cameras. At first, it all unfolded according to expectation. Safe questions, familiar answers. Carefully chosen words that sounded revealing without actually revealing much at all. Markle spoke of pressure, of misunderstanding, of the burden of public life. She framed herself as both victim and survivor, leaning into a narrative audiences had already heard but one she believed still held power. Then Cooper shifted. Not dramatically, not aggressively. Just enough to change the temperature in the room. He didn't challenge her emotions. He challenged the timeline. He didn't dismiss her feelings. He questioned the inconsistencies. With each follow-up, the conversation tightened, like a noose drawn slowly but deliberately. Facts entered the frame, dates, statements, contradictions that had lived comfortably in the shadows until now. Cooper wasn't accusing, he was inviting clarity. Clarity in this case was dangerous. Markle's smile stiffened. Not gone, just frozen, like a reflex interrupted mid-gesture. Her answers grew longer, more defensive. She began redirecting, reframing, returning again and again to personal pain when faced with objective inquiry. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. This was no longer storytelling. This was survival. What made the exchange compelling wasn't raised voices or dramatic interruptions. It was restraint. Cooper never lost his composure. He didn't press harder, he pressed smarter. A raised eyebrow here, a carefully timed pause there. Each moment allowed the audience to draw conclusions on their own. Markle, sensing control slipping, leaned into indignation, her tone sharpened. Words became rehearsed again, as though muscle memory might save her where improvisation could not. This was the moment the masks began to slip. The audience wasn't witnessing an interview anymore. They were watching two philosophies collide. One side wielded facts with quiet precision. The other wielded attitude, narrative, and moral certainty. It became clear that Markle expected sympathy, not scrutiny. Cooper offered neither condemnation, nor comfort-only accountability. And for someone accustomed to shaping the conversation, that was unsettling. As the minutes passed, the power dynamic inverted. The polished confidence Markle had entered with now felt brittle. Her gestures grew, sharper, her pauses longer. Meanwhile, Cooper remained unchanged, steady, unreactive, letting the contrast speak louder than any accusation ever could. By the time the final questions arrived, something irreversible had happened. This was no longer about royal life, media, pressure, or personal trauma. It was about credibility. About whether stories withstand examination when stripped of emotion and placed under light. The reckoning wasn't delivered through confrontation. It emerged organically, painfully in real time. When the interview ended, there was no explosive moment, no walk-off, no dramatic closing line, just a lingering sense that something fundamental had shifted. Viewers didn't feel entertained, they felt unsettled. They had witnessed a rare moment where narrative met resistance, where charisma met calm, where polish met precision. And in that pristine CNN studio, under lights designed to soften reality, something sharp had cut through. It wasn't just an interview, it was a reckoning. Her legs were crossed with deliberate elegance, her posture flawless, every inch of her composed for the camera. Her glossy hair caught the studio lights just right, forming a soft halo that framed her face, an image carefully cultivated, instantly recognizable. She offered the practiced smile that had appeared on countless magazine covers over the years, the kind designed to disarm critics and charm supporters in equal measure. It was the smile of someone who understood the power of optics, who knew how to perform warmth without necessarily offering it. Meghan. Anderson began smoothly, his voice calm and unhurried, cutting through the silence without disturbing. "Thank you for joining us tonight." "Of course," she replied, her tone sweet on the surface, but laced with something faintly performative beneath. "It's always enlightening to sit down with real journalists." The words landed softly, but the implication was sharp. Anderson caught the subtle sting immediately. Years in broadcast journalism had trained him to hear what wasn't said just as clearly as what was. Still, he didn't rise to it. He simply inclined his head in acknowledgement, refusing to reward the provocation. "Let's begin with something simple," he said evenly. "How are you and Harry doing?" For a fleeting second so brief it might have gone unnoticed by anyone less attentive. Meghan's smile froze. It wasn't a full pause, just a fractional delay, an almost imperceptible recalibration. Then she leaned back slightly, settling into her chair with an air of casual confidence, as though the question had been expected, rehearsed, mastered. "We're fine," she said. "We're thriving. Stronger than ever, actually, in spite of what the tabloids would love for people to believe." Her voice carried a sharper edge now, each syllable polished and deliberate, designed to sound definitive, final, defensive, even. The words weren't just an answer, they were a shield. Anderson nodded, maintaining a steady, unblinking gaze. He didn't rush to the next question. He let the moment breathe. "There have been rumors," he began carefully. "Some suggesting that there's tension in the marriage, that Harry struggles with being so far removed from his family, and that rumors." Meghan cut in sharply, punctuating the interruption with a light laugh. The sound was brittle, hollow, lacking genuine amusement. "Do you really want to waste your time giving oxygen to gossip?" She tilted her head slightly, her smile returning, but now it carried a pointed edge. "Honestly, Anderson, I'd expect better of you." Behind the cameras, the invited studio guests shifted in their seats. The atmosphere tightened. The dismissal wasn't subtle. It was pointed, almost disrespectful, delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling the narrative. A less seasoned interviewer might have bristled or retreated. Anderson did neither. "I understand your frustration with rumors," he said evenly, his tone unchanged. "But part of the public's interest lies in how you both are adjusting. Given the very public step you took away from royal life, isn't it fair to ask how you're navigating those changes?" The word lingered in the air. Navigating. Meghan repeated, her eyebrows lifting slightly as though she were tasting the word, testing its meaning. Her smile tightened again. "We don't navigate, we lead." She leaned forward now, her voice firm, imbued with self-assured certainty. "We've made choices that serve our happiness, our truth. If people can't handle that, perhaps they should stop projecting their unhappiness onto us." The words rang with unmistakable condescension. What was meant to be an answer sounded more like a rebuke. It wasn't explanation she was offering, it was correction. The implication was clear. Dissent didn't come from legitimate concern, only from envy or resentment. Anderson's expression didn't flicker. He didn't interrupt, didn't challenge her phrasing outright. Instead, he shuffled his cards slightly, just a small movement, so subtle it almost went unnoticed. But in that studio, it felt like a quiet signal, silent challenge. Leadership, he said calmly, choosing his words with precision, often invites scrutiny, especially when the decisions are made so publicly. Some critics argue that while you've spoken extensively about personal truth, there are inconsistencies in how certain events have been described over time. Meghan's jaw tightened. Her eyes flickered for just a moment before settling back. On him. Critics, she said coolly. Or people who've decided who I am before listening to what I've actually said. That's part of the question, Anderson replied. Listening versus examining. Stories resonate emotionally, but they also invite factual examination. Do you believe those two things can coexist? The silence stretched. For the first time since the interview began. Meghan hesitated not long, but long enough to be visible. The polished rhythm she'd entered with faltered. She shifted slightly in her chair, adjusting her posture as though reclaiming ground. I believe, she said slowly, that lived experience doesn't require validation from those who've never lived it. Anderson nodded once, thoughtfully. And yet he added, when lived experiences are shared on global platforms, they inevitably become part of a larger public conversation, one that includes verification, context, and sometimes disagreement. Studio felt colder now, as the warmth of the lights no longer softened the exchange. This was no longer a friendly sit-down. It was a philosophical collision of emotion versus examination. Narrative versus neutrality. Meghan's smile didn't return this time. By now, it was clear to everyone watching, this wasn't about rumors, or tabloids, or even royal life. It was about control, about who gets to frame reality and who gets to question it. And as Anderson sat there, calm and unmoved, it became evident that he wasn't going to surrender that role. The reckoning had begun not with raised voices, but with restraint. So let's talk about choices then, Anderson continued, his voice calm but unmistakably firmer now. You've been vocal about your difficulties with the royal family. You've described feeling unsupported, even silenced. Yet since stepping away, you've built an enormously successful platform podcasts, streaming deals, book contracts. Critics argue that you've leveraged the very institution you condemn. What would you say to them? Meghan tilted her head slightly. The smile returning, but this time it was colder, more calculated. The warmth had drained from it, leaving behind something sharper. I'd say those critics should try walking a mile in my shoes before making uninformed judgments, she replied. I don't apologize for surviving, Anderson, and I certainly don't apologize for making a living after being cut off. Her voice had grown louder, more forceful. What had begun as a measured conversation was now teetering, unmistakably toward confrontation. Anderson leaned forward just slightly, his tone still controlled, almost gentle. But Meghan, it wasn't as though you were left destitute. You had a successful acting career before Harry. He has inherited wealth. The perception, fair or not, is that the narrative of financial struggle doesn't align with reality. How do you reconcile that? Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Perception, she repeated, practically spitting the word. That's the problem, isn't it? Everyone thinks they're entitled to analyze our lives like characters in a play. They don't know the truth. They don't know what we sacrificed. Anderson let the silence breathe. He didn't rush to fill it. He allowed the audience to feel the weight of her indignation, the tension thickening in the studio. Then, softly, deliberately, he asked, What exactly did you sacrifice, Meghan? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. 4. The first time since the interview began, Meghan hesitated. Her lips parted, but the words came slower now, less rehearsed, as though she were searching for something solid to stand on. Privacy, she said finally. Peace. The right to live without being torn apart daily by people who have never even met us. Anderson nodded thoughtfully, but a flicker of steel appeared in his blue eyes. Yet here you are, he said, evenly, sitting in front of millions, telling your story on your terms. Does that not contradict the desire for privacy? Meghan bristled, her shoulders stiffened, her jaw tightening. It's not a contradiction, she snapped. It's control. We choose what to share. That's our right. Of course, Anderson replied smoothly. But that also makes you public figures who can be questioned about the choices you make. You can't ask for privacy while commanding a global spotlight without scrutiny. That's the balance journalism demands. A low hum rippled through the audience. Meghan crossed her legs more tightly, her hands clasping together in her lap. The mask of charm she'd worn so effortlessly at the beginning was thinning now, and something colder was seeping through. Balance? She echoed, her voice dripping with disdain. Funny, Anderson. You talk about balance, yet you sit there with the same smug authority as every other man who's ever tried to diminish me. The words hit like a slap in the quiet studio. Anderson blinked once, slowly absorbing the accusation. His voice, when he spoke again, remained calm, most gentle. I'm not diminishing you, Meghan. I'm holding you accountable. There's a difference. She laughed sharply, without humor. Accountable to whom? To you? To the press that twists every word I say. To a public that's already made up its mind about me. Accountable to the truth, Anderson replied. Simply, the silence that followed was deafening. What was meant to be a measured discussion had ignited into a sparring match. And for the first time, Meghan's polished composure looked fragile. The cameras continued to roll smoothly, but inside the CNN studio, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The civility of the opening minutes had evaporated. Leaving behind something raw, volatile, and deeply uncomfortable, Anderson Cooper sat composed. Pen poised between his fingers, while Meghan Markle's posture grew taut, her irritation now impossible to disguise. He didn't glance at his next card. He already knew the question. Meghan, he said, let's talk about Harry. Her expression froze for a fraction of a second, so brief it could almost be denied. Then the practiced smile returned, sharper now, like glass catching the light. Harry is thriving, she said. He's never been happier. We've built a life that finally reflects our values. So no, Anderson, he's not pining for the past, if that's what you're insinuating. I'm not insinuating, Anderson replied calmly. I'm asking, there are reports. Reports? Meghan cut in, her tone clipped and dismissive. From which tabloids? The same ones that have stalked us, lied about us, and profited from our suffering? Please, we don't dignify rumors. The audience shifted again, sensing the bite in her words. Anderson, unshaken, continued in that steady, surgical voice. Not just tabloids. There have been whispers from those close to the family, suggesting Harry feels isolated, caught between two worlds. Do you acknowledge that as a possibility? Meghan's eyes narrowed. Do you acknowledge, she shot back, that maybe Harry makes his own choices? That maybe a grown man can decide for himself where he's happiest? Or do you prefer the narrative that I somehow control him? Anderson leaned forward slightly now, his voice low, calm, but edged with unmistakable firmness. It's not about control, Meghan. It's about context. Before you, Harry was one of the most beloved members of the royal family. He had a role, a purpose, a deep connection with the British public. Since stepping away, that identity has fundamentally changed. The implication hung heavy in the air. Meghan's smile vanished completely. For the first time, there was no performance-only tension, and the reckoning, long building beneath the polished surface, was no longer avoidable. So it's a fair question, Anderson said at last, his voice steady, unflinching, more than it's given him. The question hung in the air like a live wire, crackling with implication. For a split second, the studio seemed to hold its breath. Meghan's jaw tightened visibly. Her shoulders stiffened, and for the first time that evening, her voice cracked not with vulnerability, but with heat. That is insulting, she snapped. We are partners. Equals Harry didn't lose anything. He gained freedom. He gained love. He gained me. The words landed heavy, delivered with certainty, as though they were meant to end the discussion. Anderson's gaze didn't waver. In an exchange, he said quietly, he lost his family. His military roles, his titles, his country's affection. Was that a trade worth making? Meghan let out a sharp, humorless laugh. It echoed too loudly in the polished studio. You sound like one of those bitter royalists who think the crown is sacred, she said, her tone dripping with disdain. Let me remind you, Anderson, we're not living in the 18th century. Harry doesn't need to bow and scrape for anyone's approval. A low murmur rippled through the audience. The words struck like a hammer, blow dismissive, cutting. Unapologetic, Anderson inhaled slowly, visibly grounding himself. When he spoke again, his composure remained intact. Let's pivot then, he said. Before Harry, you had a successful acting career. Many people knew you from Suits. Do you ever regret leaving that behind? Walking away from a professional identity that was entirely your own? Ain't bad. Meghan tilted her head, a faint smirk forming. At the corner of her mouth, regret, she repeated. Hardly. I outgrew it. Playing dress-up on a television set is nothing compared to the impact I've made on a global stage. I didn't trade down, Anderson. I traded up. The arrogance in her tone was unmistakable. Anderson's eyebrows rose slightly, though his voice remained even. Some might argue you traded independence for notoriety, that you went from being Meghan Markle, actress, to Meghan Markle, Duchess. Of Sussex defined primarily by your husband's name? Her composure cracked again, sharper this time. It's sexist and reductive, she shot back. I am more than my husband's wife. Of course, Anderson replied smoothly. But without Harry, would you be sitting here on this stage in front of millions? Would Netflix and Spotify have offered those contracts? Would publishing houses have chased your story with such urgency? Meghan's lips pressed into a thin, rigid line. When she spoke again, her voice was colder, flatter. You clearly don't understand who I am. I've always had influence. I've always had presence. The world just wasn't ready to acknowledge it until I forced them to. Anderson let the silence stretch. He didn't interrupt. He didn't challenge her immediately. His calm only sharpened the contrast with her rising hostility. Force, he repeated softly. That's an interesting word, she stiffened. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Anderson said carefully, that some people feel your rise wasn't organic, but accelerated, powered by proximity to the monarchy you now criticize. They question whether your influence exists independently of that association. Her eyes flashed. So now I'm guilty of marrying someone people care about? No, Anderson replied. You're being asked whether you benefited from the very system you say harmed you. Meghan leaned forward now, her posture aggressive, her voice edged with fury. That system chewed me up and spat me out. If I used my voice to rebuild afterward, that's not hypocrisy. That's resilience. And yet, Anderson said calmly, your story continues to revolve around that system. The royal family remains the central reference point in your narrative. Because they refuse to let us go, she snapped. They thrive on control. And yet you continue to speak about them, he countered, on global platforms, in lucrative deals. The tension in the room thickened, heavy, enough to feel. Meghan's fingers curled tightly together in her lap. The charm was gone now. What remained was irritation, raw and exposed. You're twisting this, she said sharply. You're trying to paint me as opportunistic? I'm trying, Anderson replied, to understand the contradiction. Her laugh was short and bitter. People like you always do this. You demand vulnerability, then punish it. You pretend to want honesty, but only if it fits your expectations. What? Clarity, he said. And clarity doesn't fear questions. For a moment, Meghan looked as though she might stand. She didn't, but the impulse flickered across her face. You know what the real problem is? She said finally. You're uncomfortable with a woman who refuses to shrink. Anderson nodded slowly. Powerful women aren't uncomfortable. To me, Meghan, inconsistency is... Another murmur rippled through the audience. She leaned back sharply, folding her arms now, a defensive posture she hadn't adopted before. I don't owe anyone coherence, she said. I owe myself survival, and the public, Anderson asked gently. The ones who listen, Who fund, who believe? They don't own me, she replied. No, he agreed. But they do have the right to question the stories they're asked to accept. The silence returned longer this time. Unforgiving, Meghan looked away for a brief moment, her eyes flicking toward the studio lights before returning to him. The confidence she'd arrived with now felt strained, stretched thin under the weight of sustained scrutiny. Anderson remained still, pen resting between his fingers, his expression unreadable. He wasn't attacking, he wasn't retreating. He was waiting, and for the first time that night. It was unclear whether Meghan Markle had another prepared answer, or whether the narrative she'd so carefully controlled was beginning to slip beyond. Her grasp, the cameras kept rolling, the lights stayed warm. But the illusion of control had fractured, and everyone in the room could feel it.